All right. Teaching methods of the Master. Really, this study is more than that. It not only has to do with his methods and methodology, but his character, his intentions as he taught, his purpose. And we'll start to look a little bit at some of his teachings in the sense of what he brought to the world. But I think we'll be done with this section here in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll be ready to move into a study of a more particular part of his teaching, that is his parables, for which he's probably most famous for. But we looked at last week and the last couple of weeks, Jesus' use of questions, how he asked them, how he used them, how he answered them. And then, of course, that kind of led us into a discussion of Jesus and controversy. He was a great controversialist, not because I think he loved or wanted to be, just not to be controversial for the sake of being controversial. Some people are like that. But because of what he had to say, he brought truth to the world, and when people don't like the truth, they don't want to hear the truth, they don't want to accept it, then that stirs up, we might say, conflict or controversy. Today we want to turn our attention to his use of illustrations, Jesus' use of illustrations in his teaching. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that is true in some instances. It's probably an overstatement, and it also depends upon the kind of information you're trying to convey. You can't just use a picture to adequately convey the gospel of Christ, the path to heaven, the nature of God. It takes words, not just pictures. And yet, illustrations are a valuable technique of communication. And certainly Jesus, as the greatest teacher of all time, was very adept in the use of word pictures. And of course, one of his favorite methods, as I just mentioned, for teaching was by use of the parable. That's an anglicized form of the Greek word parabole or parabole, which derives from 2 words, para, beside, and balo, to throw. So to throw alongside. And so as we define a parable, and we're going to talk about parables and their nature in a lot more detail, but simply they are comparison stories. But there are a lot of other comparative expressions that Jesus used and that we use besides just parables. Other word devices that present ideas in pictorial form. One scholar and commentator said that biblical scholars have cataloged some 500 different figures of speech used in the Bible. And Jesus used a lot of them. And so we want to look at just a few examples. And so we're going to kind of take you back to your high school English class. Those of you that like grammar. And the first one we want to mention is a simile. What's a simile? Everybody remembers those, right? You have a comparison drawn between 2 objects that have some similarity, but what's the identifying mark of a simile? How do you know it's a simile? Yeah, it uses words like, as, maybe even so, but generally like or as. And so that's used a lot in the New Testament. Turn over to Luke chapter 6. Luke 6, and look down in about verse 46. But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say? Whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, that is obedient, I will show you whom he is like. He is like what? A man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently against that house and could not shake it, for it was founded on the rock. But he who heard and did nothing is like a man who built a house on the earth without a foundation, against which the stream beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. So here's a man. Well, what are you comparing him to? He's not literally, the guy who hears the word and obeys it is not literally the guy building the house on the foundation, or the one who refuses to obey is not literally the guy building it without one, but that's what he's like. He's comparing it. And it helps us understand the foolishness of it, of not to obey, or the intelligence of it to hear and obey. Go over to Matthew, turn to Matthew chapter 10. We'll look at a couple more just to get an idea of what we're talking about. And he used these similes dozens of times in his teachings throughout the gospel accounts. But look in verse 16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise, how? As serpents. Well, are serpents wise? Well, kind of based on Genesis, right? Be wise as serpents, but what? Harmless as doves. Well, most of us, you kind of look at a dove and you think of something that's harmless. So wise as serpents, harmless as doves. One more. Look over at Matthew chapter 12. Well, verse 39, he answered them and said, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Now notice, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So just as, like Jonah was in the belly of that fish for 3 days and nights, that'll be similar to the Son of Man in the grave. Well, when you're in your high school English class and you get through talking about similes, what do you move to next generally? Metaphors, right? Metaphors, because they're similar to similes. They're used for comparison, but they're more direct, they're brief, they're actually a stronger statement because they don't use like or as. And there's several of those. He used them about 24 times in the gospel accounts. And so, for instance, here's one from the Old Testament, Genesis 49:9. Judah is what? A lion's whelp. Judah is a lion's whelp. No like or as, very direct, brief, to the point, therefore it makes it a stronger statement. This is the character of Judah. He's a lion's whelp. Let's look at some that Jesus used. Well, let's look at our theme for the year. Let's go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. It's right here in our theme, a metaphor, metaphors. Look at verse 13. You are, not you're like or you behave as, but you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world, a city that is set on a hill that cannot be hidden, right? So you are salt, you are light. We as Christians flavor, we preserve, we illuminate society. That's our character. You are those things. Go over to chapter 7. Here's another one. How dangerous are false prophets? Verse 15. Beware of false prophets. Some people say, false prophets, no big deal, right? Well, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are what? Ravenous wolves. That's what Jesus compares them to. Wolves are pretty ravenous. Can be. I mean, if you saw one out in the woods, what would you do? You wouldn't go up and pet it, right? So again, some very powerful figures of speech. Now, the thing about figures of speech, whether Jesus uses them or somebody else in the Bible uses them, it's extremely important to recognize them, because if we don't, we can end up being led astray into some area we're not, in some kind of doctrinal direction that's incorrect. And we have a lot of misunderstanding, and we have division not only in the religious world, but even in the church, when people refuse or cannot recognize figures of speech. Go over to Matthew chapter 26. Now here's a metaphor that many times gets misunderstood. The Catholic Church teaches, when it comes to the communion, things like transubstantiation and consubstantiation. What do I mean by those terms? What do they teach? Yeah, that when they take of the elements of the communion, they literally become the body and blood of the Lord. That's not what he said. He used a metaphor in this section. Look in verse 26. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." That's a metaphor. How do I know it's not his body? He's sitting in his body. He's in his body. He's sitting there talking to them in his body. So if he hands them a piece of bread and says, "This is my body," well, that can't be literally his body. It's a figure of speech. Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." Same thing. A metaphor. But because people don't understand it, take it literally, rather than a figure of speech, they come up with all kinds of false doctrines. And we're going to see another one in this passage in a minute, but we'll come back to it. Metonymy, a change in name. The name of one object is changed to something else to intensify a comparison. Jesus used metonymy. Look over to Luke chapter 13. Changing the name of something to something else to emphasize or to intensify a comparison. Look in 13 verse 32. Look at 31. On that very day some Pharisees came, saying to him, "Get out and depart from here, for Herod wants to kill you." That's Herod Antipas. He's already killed John the Baptist, right? And he said to them, "Go tell," what did he say? Go tell Herod? He changed his name here. He said, "Go tell that fox. Behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected." And so he says, you go tell that fox about the things that the signs I'm performing. That's metonymy. Well, go to chapter 22. This is one that gets misunderstood in the Lord's church, especially. Then he took the what? Cup, and gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God come." Well, it tells me all right there, even though this is metonymy, it tells me in the context what he's referring to. When he refers to the cup and says, "Divide this among yourselves," is he talking about the container? Is that what represents his blood, the container? People get all hung up on the container, right? You can only use one. Well, we'll use Lauren's. She's got one. No. What's he talking about? Tells me right here in the context. He's talking about the contents of the container, right? I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. You remember those cryptic statements he made in John chapter 6? Sometimes people get confused and think he's talking about the Lord's Supper. He's not. Go over to John chapter 6 and look at beginning about verse 48. And it runs down through several verses. But he says, I'm the bread of life. Your fathers are the manna in the wilderness. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever, and the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. The Jews therefore quarreled among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Well, it's because he's using a figure of speech here. Metonymy. The Jews therefore quarreled. Then Jesus said, most assuredly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. Well, he's not talking about the Lord's Supper. What's he talking about? What's he talking about here? Eating his flesh, drinking his blood. Yeah, his teaching, appreciating the meaning of his incarnation and the value of his death, his atoning death, and appreciating that doctrine and that teaching. You must accept these things, he says. And so when we get confused on that, it can cause a lot of problems. How about this? What about the use of paradox? The Greek word paradoxos, which signifies something unexpected, when we see a paradox, we're usually looking at a sentence that appears to contain a contradiction, right? Like the way up is down, that kind of thing. Remember, you can go into the Beatitudes, for instance, and see several. The poor in spirit will what? Possess the kingdom of God. Those who mourn will be what? Comforted. The meek inherit the earth. The hungry and thirsty are filled. But here's some that you're more familiar with. Turn over to Matthew chapter 10. And he uses a paradox in both Matthew 10 and 11. Looking about verse 39. Here's one. He who finds his life will what? Lose it. And he who loses his life for my sake will find it. Go to the next chapter, 11, verse 11. Assuredly, I say to you, among those born of women, there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist. But, listen to this, he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Well, how can that be? No one born of woman is greater than John the Baptist, and yet he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. How's that possible? That's paradoxical, right? How's that possible? Because John was never in the kingdom. He died before it was established. He didn't get to enjoy the blessings that we do. He lived and died under the old law. And so, paradoxical statement. Hyperbole, you've heard of that. Another very dramatic figure of speech, and that's common to literature in general. But basically, hyperbole is a deliberate exaggeration, right? For dramatic emphasis. Hyper, over and above, the Greek word, balo, to throw. And so, hyperbole, exaggeration for a point. Look over to Matthew chapter 5. Here's one that Jesus used. if your right eye causes you to sin, what? Pluck it out. For it is unprofitable for you that one of your members perish, than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, do what? Cut it off. Well, now, does anybody in here believe for the moment, for any minute, that Jesus was teaching self-mutilation? No. But he's making a point by exaggeration that, hey, whatever it is that stands between you and God, between you and heaven, you got to get rid of it. You got to deal with it. You've got to avoid whatever the spiritual pitfall that's dangerous to you. He does the same thing in Matthew 19. Go over there. He's talking about marriage and divorce. We've got some hyperbole there. He gives the teaching that, hey, it's supposed to be, one man, one woman for life. And then he gives this one exception, fornication. And they said, well, Moses let us get divorced for other reasons. And he said, well, that's not the way it was intended from the beginning. Y'all were spiritually immature in that age, hardness of heart. It was permitted, but never the ideal. I'm taking you back to the beginning, to the ideal, and this is the way it's going to be under my covenant and under my law. His disciples said, and notice, people today want to give excuses and they want to give other exceptions, blah, blah, blah. But the reason I can tell you that that's not possible. Oh, well, if you become a Christian, you can just stay in this sinful relationship, so forth and so on. But the reason I can tell you that's not possible is because even his disciples understood the seriousness of this. Notice what they said in verse 10. If such is the case of the man with his wife, it's just better not to marry. Man, that's tough, Jesus. Well, he uses some hyperbole here in about verse 12. He said, all cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb. They may have had some physical defect. It doesn't allow them to engage in sexual relations. And there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men. They would be captured in war and used to guard the king's harem, so they would make them eunuchs. So they knew they wouldn't mess with the wives or the concubines. But now notice what he says here in this hyperbolic statement. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Now, does he mean that these people have literally castigated themselves for spiritual reasons? No. What's he saying? This point follows on what he's just taught them. There are some people who had to totally refrain from sexual relations in order to be right with God, in order to be right in the kingdom. And so it is a tough law that's laid down. And he uses hyperbole in that discussion, dealing with discipline as opposed to unlawful sexual relations. What's a synecdoche? Yeah, it can be used one of two ways. It's when the part is put for the whole, or the whole is put for the part. That's used actually quite a bit in the Bible. And I didn't actually have one from the gospel accounts, but the best one I know of is found in Acts 2 and Acts 20. Let's turn over there so you'll know when you see it. Either a part is put for the whole, or the whole is put for a part. For instance, sometimes in the book of Acts, it'll say things like, if we talk about someone obeyed the gospel, what does that mean? It means that, there's a lot of steps involved in that. But look how it refers to the Lord's Supper a couple of times here in the book of Acts. Look at Acts 2:42. Then fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done to the apostles. No, that's not the right one. Oh, there it is, 42. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, what? In the breaking of bread and in prayers. Well, the breaking of bread represents what? That's the Lord's Supper. Part is put for the whole. And you say, well, wait a minute, that's common meal. No, the common meal is mentioned in verse 46. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. That's the common meal. Go back to 42 and we're talking about worship, the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, that's the Lord's Supper, and prayers. Go to Acts chapter 20. It's the same phraseology. Again, same figure of speech. Paul's waiting in Troas to partake of the Lord's Supper. Now notice verse 7. On the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to what? Break bread. That's the Lord's Supper. That's a figure of speech. The part is put for the whole. So the point is, the Bible uses, well look, it's no different than us in modern day America. You know, you go throughout the day and you use probably several figures of speech, right? I'm so hungry I could eat a horse or whatever, you know. I'm as full as a tick. I'm about to bust. I mean, we use figures of speech all day long. And they did as well. And when people fail to recognize that, and Jesus used them quite a bit in his teachings because it helps to convey ideas and thoughts in a way that if you never used them, speech would be pretty drab, right? Be pretty boring. But it's a way to make points in a very effective way, and in a kind of a pictorial way. So illustrations, Jesus used a lot of them. His most famous being his parables, which we'll talk obviously more in detail in a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. The next thing I want to mention, and I kind of want to transition from his methodology to more to his substance. And no, we don't have time to talk about every doctrine that Jesus taught, but he did bring a lot of either new or improved philosophies and ideas to the world when he arrived and in his teaching. And the first thing I want to point out about his teaching was that Jesus' teaching was practical in nature. In other words, I mean, have you ever taken a class in college or something and you came out of there and you thought, you know, everything in this class is theory. When am I ever going to use this, you know, in my everyday life, right? It's just purely theoretical. Well, Jesus, of course, taught some pretty lofty themes and subjects, taught on them, but still his teaching was for a purpose. It was meant to affect the everyday human condition and the way we live. And so it was very practical in its substance and to affect our daily living. It was meant to be down to earth. Now, I want to mention 2 or 3 things here. Number one, Jesus' teaching, more than anybody else's that's ever been in this world, broke down barriers. Division. You'll hear a lot on the news now about, you know, living in a, quote, divided country, right? There's a lot of division. Well, how do you bring people together, right? What can bring people together? Well, there's only one person and one doctrine that I know of that can bring people together from all cultures, races, socioeconomic status, whatever the case might be. and that is Jesus and the gospel of Christ. And so he came breaking down barriers in his teaching. And look, the first century was no different from the 21st century. Superstitious, prejudice, ugly attitudes. Early in his ministry, let's turn over to John chapter 4. Early in his ministry, he started feeling a little resistance, a little heat. Decided it was time to go north for a while. And notice verse 1 of chapter 4, the Pharisees heard that he baptized more disciples and so forth. So he departs to Galilee. But notice this phrase in verse 4. But he needed to go through Samaria. I think the King James says, or the American Standard, he must needs pass through Samaria. That word must, D-E-I in the Greek, is commonly used for a spiritual imperative. How did Jews normally get from Judea to Galilee? Well, they went around Samaria, right? Going to walk through Samaria. And yet this passage says he needed, spiritually speaking, to go through Samaria. Well, why did he need to go through Samaria? He's going to break down some barriers. It wasn't a physical necessity. He could go around it. But he's tired and he stops at Jacob's well, and the disciples leave him to go to the nearby town. Jacob's well was near Sychar, and they go to the nearby town to buy food. And who comes out to the well? A woman. A woman. Of all things, a woman. The Jewish Talmud said, let no one talk with a woman in the street, no, not with his own wife. Notice how the disciples reacted. Let's see, go over to verse 27. And at this point, his disciples came and they what? Marveled that he did what? Talked with a woman. Here's Jesus in public talking to a woman. So they were surprised, to say the least. So I guess what I would say, the first barrier that he bridged in this society and in this culture was the gender gap. Here was Jesus talking to a woman in public. Number one, the gender gap. Now, number two, the Samaritans, how were they looked upon by the Jews? Dogs, right? And dogs weren't thought of highly in the first century like we think of them now. They were a mongrel breed, a mixture of Hebrew and pagan heritage. Hostility between the two groups. And yet here's Jesus engaging not only a woman, but a Samaritan woman in dialogue. And look at this. No self-respecting Jew would have said, give me a drink, and then drank from her container. So the fact that she's a Samaritan, first, he bridges the gender gap and breaks down that barrier. Second, he bridges, I don't know what you want to call it, the ethnic gap. And says, I'll talk to somebody of another ethnicity. Doesn't matter to me. Their soul's just as valuable as anybody else's. Well, you know the account. They get into this discussion. He says, go get your husband. And she says, what? Well, I don't have a husband. And he said, well, I guess that's true. You've had 5. And the guy you're with now is not your husband. Now, that reminds us of some people you probably know in your own circle. The way people live nowadays, right? So I would say that here he's breaking down a moral barrier. What do we sometimes do when we run into people that we perceive as just being disgustingly immoral, what's our response? Avoid them. Now, I understand telling children to avoid them, but as adults, Jesus saw this woman as a potential convert, no matter what her situation was, no matter what her lifestyle was. He didn't see her as an enemy. He saw her as a potential convert. So I would say he bridged a moral barrier there. Well, you recall that as Jesus gets kind of personal, what does she do? What does she do when Jesus starts getting a little personal? She changes the subject. And what subject does she change it to? Worship. Well, our fathers worship in this mountain, Mount Gerizim, and you Jews say, you have to worship in Jerusalem. Now, I dare say some religious people would have responded to her this way. Well, that's fine. You worship where you want to worship, and we'll worship where we want to worship, and everybody's okay, right? Is that the way he responded? No. He says, back in verse 21, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. Now notice, you worship what you do not know." We know what we worship. For salvation is of or out of the Jews. Well, that kind of settles that. She said, we worship, which one's right? Well, you're wrong. That's what he tells her, you're wrong. The ignorance barrier. Proper worship requires proper procedure that must be learned and engaged in correctly. And yet, even though he was willing to tell it to her like it was, she didn't get mad and run off. I guess he had engaged her enough by this time that she was willing to listen to more. And they had developed some kind of, repartee, as we say. So she just didn't run off and get mad. But he says, hey, salvation's from the Jews. And so he more or less assaults her ignorance. But again, look at all the barriers that he broke down just in one conversation. Gender, ethnicity, right? Morality, spiritual ignorance, religious ignorance. He broke down a lot of barriers. And he can do that today. The gospel can do that today if we will let it. The other thing that, another practical point of his teaching was that it changed or renovated society. What I mean by that is obviously the world's a better place. The world is much different now than it was before he came. His leavening influence through his followers. I mean, you think about any of a lot of the good things that have been done in this world since he was here, they've generally been done in his name. How many hospitals do you know of named after atheists? Name me one. Now, how many hospitals can you think of that were started by religious organizations looking to help people because he helped people? I mean, just here we've got Baptist and Methodist and St. Francis, right? St. Jude. I know in Nashville there's St. Thomas. The world's a different place because of his teaching. For instance, look at his teaching on marriage. We already said he came to restore the marital institution to its ideal status. Why is that important? Why is that important for human welfare? If you look at, and historians will tell you, if you look at the downfall of any civilization, any empire in history, the first thing or one of the major causes you're going to see is the degeneration of what? The home. The home. The family unit is the bedrock of civilization. And I'm talking about mom and dad and the children. I'm not talking about Bob and Fred or, Jill and Jane or any of that. It provides for an identifiable family unit where marriage does, wherein one has the right to familial identity, the generational security of private property, and an intimate atmosphere of love and trust. Strong marriage, when acknowledged and respected, strong marriage law contributes to community stability and societal security, and frankly is the glue that holds cooperative bodies together within communities. And so it also creates an atmosphere in which we can do what in the family unit, which is what God intended for it to do. What did He intend for it to be done in the family unit? To do what? Yeah, to teach our children about Him and about human redemption. It begins there. If there's anybody in the world we ought to want to save and work hard at saving, it's who? It's people in our own family, right? What if everybody saved their own family? So, obviously, when the marital relationships degenerate, it has a terrible decaying effect on society. And then, of course, the gospel of Christ. Look, it's not a very ideal climate. If you start having a bunch of, quote, family units that are made up of homosexuals and lesbians adopting children that they cannot even have, well, what kind of climate is that family for propagating the gospel? How receptive are they going to be? Not very. In the Greek and Roman world, fornication was universally countenanced among most groups. We talked about this before. The wife, as far as the Romans were concerned, was for propagating the property and the family name, but that didn't mean he wasn't off over here doing whatever he wanted to with both men and women. Virtue, as it's seen in Christianity, was a novel concept in the Roman Empire, and it really changed the world dramatically. And when a nation leaves chastity and moral behavior behind, it's just asking for death, really. And so He made the world a better place, just as in that one example is teaching on the importance of marriage in the home. And the last thing I'll say is it was practical in the fact that it brought us deliverance, and we'll talk a little bit about that next week. There's a chapter in one of the books I have at home where a guy talks about the impeccable teachings of Jesus. We'll talk a little bit about that next week.